Welcome to the Antidote. I'm Greg McCarran.
And I'm Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Jeremy, before we get into our main topic, which is of course, the major event of the previous week, which is the official recognition by Trump that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel, and ultimately plans on moving the U.S. embassy there. There has been breaking news this morning of an attack. I believe it was is it on a bus in Manhattan this morning?
It was in
Or
the
is it a
Port
terminal?
Authority in a train station.
Okay, train station. Train station. Three people are heard. A Bangladeshi been identified as being a culprit, has been taken in alive, which is usually not the case with a lot of these attacks. Um, we're just starting to find out information about this, and you had a few things you wanted to say about it.
I'll admit that I'm initially quite skeptical of the timing and the nature of this attack. And luckily, no one was killed, which is good. And there's a few injuries, and the alleged it's supposedly a pipe bomb, a failed pipe bomb attack is the way that it's being alleged to have taken place, and with a guy with wires sticking out, and it's a sort of a failed attack, and he supposedly is injured but alive. And I just noticed the timing of this and the people who are coming out intensely. Think about this compared to the Las Vegas operation that's still very little known about from official sources. Here in this case, we have people like the police commissioner Bratton very quickly tying it to ISIS, people like John Miller, and people should go look at John Miller, who has been sort of an attache of some sort in relationship to Bratton and other aspects of the deep police state, maybe we call it. And John Miller, of course, plays the role as he works with the FBI, but he's also on CBS News, and he's also main assistant spokesperson to Bratton a lot of times, including in Los Angeles. And also John Miller is one of the handful of people that I believe interviewed or did intimate reporting on Osama bin Laden in the run-up to September 11th. So these are some of the deepest state creatures you could imagine, who are immediately on the record giving us lots of information, pictures of the guy, claims about the connection to ISIS, and all these types of things. We still haven't seen any videos from inside the hotels at the Las Vegas operation. And so I would balance those two in terms of balancing whether this is some type of deep state operation, the way that it's moving forward. And one last thing is I would look out for things about trying to tie ISIS as somehow having a solidarity with the Palestinians in the wake of the Jerusalem announcement. And of course, you have people like former head of Mossad, I believe Halevi, on the record talking about how when it came to Syria, it was clear that Israeli intelligence was much more, was at the very least less afraid of ISIS than they were of the Syrian democratically elected government. So that sort of gives you a sense. And of course, ISIS has been on the border of Israel, seemingly have gotten help from Israel, and appears to align very much ways with as a proxy of certain aspects of Israeli foreign policy. And yet they have been in many ways not aligned with, at least publicly, with the idea of the Palestinians and their struggle against Zionist occupation. But watch for those types of things to begin to be hinted at.
Great points there, particularly the point of tying this alleged, what we will, based on precedents and based on past events, we can pretty much conclude will be identified most likely probably within the day as being, some type of ISIS cell, or will take responsibility for it. That's most likely scenario based on what we've seen in the past with these attacks. But yeah, be very careful and be very wary of any type of effort to try to tie in the Palestinian cause and anger over this Jerusalem decision with this attack. And anyway, that's a great thank you for the breakdown. That's a great segue into our first topic, which of course is the major news story of the past week, which is Donald Trump's official announcement of recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel, and by extension the Jewish people, and the global reaction to it, which has been most interesting. And so with this, it's very clear that this was Donald Trump keeping one of his probably 2 or 3 major campaign promises. It appears to me that Trump has, I'd say, maybe 3 campaign promises which have taken precedence, which have been given the most emphasis over any other. One, of course, is the building a wall domestically at the border with Mexico. Then the other 2, of course, have been directly related to foreign policy and to Israel, and that is, number 1 is moving the embassy from Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. Of course, official acknowledgement of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which is unprecedented move by an American president, despite all the lip service paid to it over the years. That would be the second promise. And of course, the third promise, which I think is going to tie deeply into our conversation a little later on when we start discussing Michael Flynn and some of the people around him, is the tearing up of the Iran nuclear deal. But clearly, when it comes to at least the stated goals of the Trump administration foreign policy, the stated goals of Donald Trump, the candidate, moving this embassy and recognizing Jerusalem's capital, moving this embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was clearly one of the main pillars of his foreign policy. And I guess you could throw in the
one last thing I just wanted to point out too, in relationship to this, that connects back to the previous discussed incident in New York City, but also forward to Flynn, is the Muslim ban commitment of Trump, that at the time we found out was tied right back into Frank Gaffney, who of course has close connections to Flynn. But in the wake of this incident in New York City, where the alleged bomber is said to be from Bangladesh, in the wake of the Supreme Court finding that the ban of the predominantly Muslim countries was constitutional, I think you and I believe you're already seeing this, that people are going to say it wasn't a Muslim ban that Trump implemented, but we need one because Bangladesh wasn't on the list, and look what happened from this Muslim immigrant.
Excellent point. That is, excellent point. I couldn't agree more with that, and that is very, very much true. And of course, this all ties back in together with this idea of a bigger war on radical Islam and terrorism and the clash of civilizations, which we've talked so much about. And clearly, moving this embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is a major symbolic act, obviously, and it's something, and very significantly, though, I think the significance of it in a manner of Trump is, not only is he somebody who has done this, who's followed through on a promise that no other president has made, despite all the lip service being paid to it. I guess most presidents realize that it's just not something that can be realistically done without creating perhaps the potential for some major chaos within the entire region and perhaps globally. But also a very interesting comment from Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., or the U.S. the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. on Sean Hannity's show the other night. He stated that, for those of you who are into symbolism and numbers, he stated that Trump was the 13th president since the foundation of the modern-day state of Israel, and he mentioned that 13 is a very lucky number for Jewish people. So I thought that was rather interesting, in addition to the other symbolic elements to this embassy move. And of course, Dermer specifically mentioning the number 13. I don't know if there's anything to that, but it certainly shouldn't just be completely dismissed as being nothing. So I thought that was interesting. But this decision has clearly set off a lot of alarms from the global community, particularly within Europe. You've had everybody from French President Macron to Prime Minister May to Angela Merkel to Pope Francis condemned this decision, and Netanyahu and Macron were going back and forth about this decision. Netanyahu says Paris is the capital of France, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Why would you argue with us about that? And now expected to be a very tense meeting with Netanyahu meeting with the heads of the European Union today and some of the European capitals. So we're seeing, I think, with this whole thing, and the reaction of much of the global, what we call the DC foreign policy establishment, which is not down with much of these hardline right-wing Israeli policies, you've seen this a continuation, I think, of the overall reactions and the shifting of the world under Obama versus the world under Trump, where you're having more of this alignment with the hardline policies of Israel and the Likud party in particular, rather than the Obama administration, which shifted away from that and more towards a detente with Iran in some ways, a less acceptance and tolerance of the Israeli settlement policies, and just a shifting away from a lot of what the Israeli right wing wants. I look at, for example, with this whole Saudi Arabia thing with Mohammed bin Salman, which so many in the alternative media are portraying as a draining of the Saudi swamp, much like what happened in D.C. I look at this as just I think this is a major move to turn away from the Obama administration foreign policy. We had an Arab Spring, which on one hand raised the pressure and create a lot of chaos and instability in the region via Libya and Syria, but also was, I think, a deliberate moving away from much of much of what you call maybe the neocon policy in the Middle East, which is a hawkish rhetoric against Iran, more of a free reign for Israel to do whatever it wants in the region. And now I think that those tables are being turned now back, shifting into the corner of the Likud and the hardline Zionist foreign policy. And I think this Jerusalem embassy decision was a major shot in that battle.
It would seem so, and especially in relationship to this dynamic with the Flynn case and how it's looking to be that this axis of Russiagate ties right back into Israeli involvement in American politics. And then directly in the wake of that, and this complaint that involved Israeli meddling in American domestic politics, comes the first fulfillment by the American executive branch to move, to recognize and move things to Jerusalem. And of course, aspects of Trump's support are pointing out, he's just the first one to keep his word. There are aspects of that are definitely true, and at the same time, you can sort of see in the wake of a little tiny bit of disciplining by the end of the Obama administration, of just sitting on their hands while a 14-0 vote could take place by the rest of the world to recognize known illegal settlements. The settlements are illegal under the Geneva Conventions, but I guess also...
On top of that, I just wanted to mention that the entire UN Security Council has also unanimously condemned the Jerusalem announcement as well.
So in the wake of September 11th, when the Geneva Conventions have apparently been cast aside, including things around torture, then I guess it sort of makes sense that we're living in a post-legal era in relationship to things like settlements in long-term military occupied areas, which is ultimately can be described as population transfers, or using population transfers to call a long-term colonize an area. So it's interesting that this is not really controversial move in terms of internationally recognized law, but it is very controversial in relationship to the United States and its groveling in many ways, at least verbally, to some of the hardliners in Israel over decades. And this does seem to tie back into what we were saying early on, or even before the Trump administration was inaugurated, that in many ways this looked in a certain way like the Israeli hardliners really had their first full-on presidential agent in the White House. And yes, during the H.W. Bush days, there was Dan Quayle, and Dan Quayle, of course, was tied into Bill Kristol. But even Bill Kristol, in many ways, is showing himself to not be patriotic enough to the hardliners in the Jewish state. And Bill Clinton was, even though he had an apparent Israeli intelligence handler as his chief of staff in the figure of Rahm Emanuel, that was not enough, and he was not bombing enough Muslim countries. Apparently, the sanctions were not enough in Iraq, and so there's signs that things like Monica Lewinsky was a honeypot-shaped charge funneled at the sexual deviant and likely criminal Bill Clinton, and there have been allegations that things changed very much so after Bill Clinton was weakened by his impeachment process. And then you have George W. Bush, who had neocons all around, some of them Israeli second neocons, and some of them Israeli first neocons. And but he also, I guess, was not Likud enough. And so then Obama, it was not enough to have someone like Rahm Emanuel again in the power position in terms of chief of staff early on. And then Obama wanted to put in people like Chaz Friedman in certain positions, and then people like Chuck Hagel, who was not seen as Israeli first enough. So then you have Trump and the direct ties back to this Lansky mob surrounding him in New York City, down to Florida, and increasingly seeing this access of the Russiagate tied into Turkey, tied into some of the former stands, and then directly back into Tel Aviv. And I guess now we're going to start saying tied directly back into Jerusalem.
Indeed. And, you mentioned all those names that weren't sufficiently Zionist enough. And interestingly enough, towards the end of his life, Ariel Sharon was criticized because he wasn't doing enough. He was giving too many concessions to the Palestinians. I mean, that's just how extreme these people are. These people who have been, these same people, both within the Orthodox, the hardline community in Israel, as well as within the hardline Zionist, in many cases, evangelical community in the U.S., the same ones who were claiming that Sharon was giving away too much to the Palestinians are the ones who were portraying Donald Trump as being like a Messiah type figure, almost a biblical type Messiah type character who is going to fulfill the promises that God granted to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel in the Old Testament. So even with someone like even Ariel Sharon is not considered enough of a butcher like that is not considered enough of a hardliner for these people. I think that's pretty scary, but you just wonder at what point does you pointed this out before, is that these people will never stop making demands, particularly these hardline messianic religious type people, both Christian and Jewish, who are all about this apocalyptic end of times and bringing it about via making these symbolic gestures.
And isn't it significant that it appears that as these sort of hardline, sort of secular types, in terms of people like maybe like Dermer, these types of people, maybe the core of Israeli intelligence, are coming more and more into the spotlight, into the front of power situations. You also have the rise of Chabad Lubavitch, which in many ways I see as the military intelligence arm of the global Jewish deep state, operating around the world from an intensely religious perspective, but very much tied into the kind of business and industrial and intelligence networks that make the world go around. And of course, a key figure in thinking about things like that are people that have tight connections to Trump, and most intensely his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is fully on display as a very likely Israeli intelligence asset, if not long-term operative of some sort. But figures such as Lev Levayev, the billionaire diamond merchant from Israel, whose family did real estate deals with the Kushners, or people even like Felix Sater, who was recognized as a leading man in New York Chabad community. So this is trying.
Donald Trump claims that he wouldn't recognize Felix Sater in a room full of people. Give me a break.
And at the same time, I would say that there's a sense that this announcement is working as a provocation of some sort. It's very provocative, And it is working to provoke reaction and response, not only amongst the Palestinians, but around the world, especially amongst Muslim populations, but also in relation to people who are interested in rule of law worldwide. But in casting back to something that I believe that we pointed to months ago, when there was the first stationing of U.S. naval forces, I believe, in Israel, there was a sense that there was a wind up to potential false flags in the area, on the ground, potentially even in Israel, that might be blamed on forces tied back into, likely to Lebanon and Hezbollah, that could then leverage a significant move for aggressive warfare. And so I would still keep our eyes on that type of move that begins in relationship to the Hamas rockets being shot into southern Israel, but will eventually amplify its way into a likely big-scale false flag event that can be leveraged to provoke aggressive warfare, likely against Hezbollah.
Great point. And once again, and that's very yes, indeed. And you could see this this in many ways, I think, a very legitimate destruction, a very legitimate defeat of the current Islam proxy forces of radical Islam, which is, of course, which is propagated as the proxy forces of radical Islam, which is currently ISIS. And you could see ISIS being phased out for perhaps a renewed emphasis on Hezbollah as being the leading terror group in the region. Of course, Hezbollah, you can direct Hezbollah directly to Iran and also to Lebanon, which has long been a goal of Israeli, one of their prizes has long been Lebanon. And so with the Hezbollah, and I just want to say this is just real quick, and I'm not saying that this is fact or anything, but we cannot dismiss the possibility. We got to look at the people that are the most enthusiastically diehard supportive of Trump, and particularly within foreign policy, it's these religious hardliners, these religious zealots, both of the Jewish and Christian stripe, that want to bring about this apocalyptic battle, which will, bring about the end times as prophesied in the Bible and the book of Revelation. And so what happens if there's another major scale false flag under Trump, and you see these people that are at the forefront of this, and now it's being epitomized by the elevation of people such as Roy Moore, the Old Testament thumping former judge in Alabama who's being put on a Senate campaign. We're going to talk about him in a little bit, but when you see these people who are being brought forth and the people that are the most enthusiastically supportive of Trump, how, you can see this. Bush was seen as a guy who, he talked about Gog and Magog allegedly, and the idea of a religious war, and how this war against Islam was a crusade in some ways, even though he publicly paid lip service to the idea of being humane to Muslims and to Islam and not condemning all Muslims and religion post September 11th. But if that was the case under Bush, now you've got this Trump who, with his Mike Pence, of course, who I think is more of a true believer in a lot of this end times prophecy stuff that even a lot of the people around Bush. What happens? I mean, you just have to wonder, like, how would this be portrayed? And I think that once again, it could be portrayed in ways that it never could have been portrayed under Bush, in a much scarier possible result, as a result of how it would be the narrative would be fed to the Trump base and to much of the conservative base in general. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yes, I think that's important to recognize, and especially more and more thinking about this relationship of Zionism as an actual as it's used as a religious force, especially in relationship to Christian Zionism, and how much of the Schofield Bible has been used to pattern Christian Zionist mind in a very specific way in terms of thinking about Israel as in a religio-historical context. Because, of course, a lot of the way that this kind of long-term occupation and militancy coming out of Israel is justified is by way of saying that this is justified by God and by history. And when you actually put aside your preconceptions and you look to the actual complicated history, both religious and geohistorical here, it becomes a lot more complicated. So I think that it's time for us to begin to have conversations about the deep background, let's say, of this current situation.
Yes, indeed. And so we'll see what happens in the future here, but I just feel that that can't be entirely dismissed when you see all the factors that are at play here, particularly just the messianic fervor that the election and inauguration of Trump was taken with by both Jewish and Christian um, religious fundamentalists, particularly of the hard right wing variety. So I think that this is just something that just can't be entirely dismissed. And now the talk of the messianic fervor and the biblical like proportions of this decision, which I believe was the headline on Breitbart, this was biblical like in terms of the epicness of the importance of it. So they can't entirely dismiss that. Now with the Jerusalem embassy decision, of course it came on the heels of the revelation that Russia, that the meddling that Michael Flynn has been under investigation for all these months. At least one of the things he's been under investigation for turns out to have been a conversation which was all about Israel, and that was that Michael Flynn had lied about his contact with the ambassador Sergei Kislyak, and that actually the real purpose of his meeting with Kislyak and of his conversations with him was to try to encourage the Russians to delay this UN vote on the settlements, the increased Israeli settlement building, which of course you referred to earlier as the Obama administration refused to veto, which broke a decades-long precedent of the U.S. and the United Nations using its veto power to pretty much make any type of legislation critical of Israel completely just irrelevant and meaningless, in which, of course, that was, as you said, a symbolic kind of a slap in the face to kind of an F you from Obama, I think, to Netanyahu and some of the hardline Israelis who had been pressuring him for 8 years. But the significance of that, and you see that Flynn, the Russian meddling, once again, appears to be, it does in so many different cases, tied back to Israel. And Michael Flynn, we've discussed him before. We've discussed what he was doing as the national security advisor before he was removed, which is, of course, where this whole thing started. It turns out, I guess, we're supposed to believe he lied to Pence about his contacts with Kislyak over the Israeli settlement vote. But what was Flynn doing the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration? As soon as Trump took office, Michael Flynn was already threatening Iran. Iran is officially on notice. And then you've got Flynn removed as the national security advisor, replaced by H.R. McMaster, who begins to purge some of the Flynn's top supporters within the national security, or within the NSA, within his circle. And before we get into where we're going to go with this with Flynn, and we're going to tie in a couple other people, Ezra Cohen-Watnick and Michael Ledeen, to this, you had a statement, which I believe it was about Michael Flynn related to the Flynn case that you wanted to read real quick.
Well, I wanted to go through the actual allegation, the charge against Flynn. It's so short that it's easy to go through. And it was filed in front of Judge Contreras, who since then actually has recused himself, apparently, I believe because he might have been involved in the FISA panel decision to probably unmask some of these NSA intercepts that involved Flynn and these conversations. So it's a very, very thin allegation against Flynn, and that he's pled guilty to. And so it says it's false statements is the one and only count. On or about January 24th, 2017, defendant Michael T. Flynn did willfully and knowingly make materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statements and representations in a matter within the jurisdiction of the executive branch of the government of the United States. To wit, the defendant falsely stated and represented to agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. that 1, on or about December 29th, 2016, Flynn did not ask the government of Russia's ambassador to the United States to refrain from escalating the situation in response to sanctions that the United States had imposed against Russia that same day. And Flynn did not recall the Russian ambassador subsequently telling him that Russia had chosen to moderate its response to those sanctions as a result of his request. And two, on or about December 22nd, 2016, Flynn did not ask the Russian ambassador to delay the vote on or defeat a pending United Nations Security Council resolution, and that the Russian ambassador subsequently never described to Flynn Russia's response to his request. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001A2. So it is very, very brief, but and it does, of course, it does involve certain negotiations with Russia in relationship to the sanctions. But it does look like you said, that the main focus of those conversations were very likely as some type of relationship to trying to get Russia to delay this vote, which they did not do. And so this complaint, of course, is signed by Mueller. But there's also some other people that have signed underneath here, which brings up some interesting questions about what is actually going on with this Mueller investigation. So I looked into it a little bit. The first person who signed is Brandon Van Grack, and then Zainab and Ahmad, senior assistant special counsels, the special counsel's office. And so there are some interesting things. A lot is being made that of the taking off of one of the people on the special counsel who was very much a Hillary Clinton partisan and very anti-Trump and these types of things. And I think that's important to look into. And there are some indicators that, yes, there is an aspect of some partisanship here potentially. But I think it goes even deeper. And for example, this Brandon Van Grack, who signed it, he's a veteran prosecutor in the counter-espionage section of the DOJ's National Security Division. And he actually helped prosecute a former government contractor who stole classified national defense documents and a computer hacker who provided the Islamic State with the names and contact information of over 1,000 government and military workers. And he was leading a grand jury inquiry in the Eastern District of Virginia into Flynn's lobbying on behalf of foreign governments, which was reportedly since been picked up by Mueller. So it does look like it's heading in this direction. And so some of the points that we need to put on the table are the sort of fleshing out of who was Flynn, who did Flynn actually advocate on behalf of, now that it's become clear from this complaint. And of course, Israel's not directly named in the complaint, but everybody knows that that second charge has very much to do with the Israeli government and Netanyahu lobbying through his agent Kushner into not yet even a sitting government in order to undermine the then sitting Obama administration's desires in terms of the UN Security Council. But then also this second person who signed it is a woman named Zainab Ahmad, and she's actually has successfully prosecuted 13 terrorism suspects for the U.S. government without losing a single case. Some of her biggest cases include the prosecution of a Pakistani al-Qaeda operative planning a terrorist attack on a UK shopping center, and of a Nigerian citizen convicted of providing material support to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I think this is interesting. Of course, there's aspects of this that are obviously controlled in relationship to what is the war on terror, actually, what is al-Qaeda, what was September 11th, who did it and why. At the same time, as you can see, this is the person in a certain way who was showing that you could do Article 3, Section 3, Article 3 trials of alleged terrorist suspects, and it not be in this hidden military court down in Guantanamo, where the discovery process is highly limited and there's not a lot of public due process where the public gets information out of it. And so I would ask people to remember that during the Obama administration, there was a push to actually try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for September 11th in court, in a Article 3 court in New York City.
Boy, people really lost their minds over that, didn't they? How dare you try a 9/11 conspirator here in the U.S. instead of just torturing him even more than the 183 times he'd already been tortured?
Yes, he was waterboarded that many times in a series of torturous events. And of course, there was so much pressure, and who knows what kind of internal threats were made. But the 9/11 conspirators, I would say, assert, could not have a public trial with all of the Article 3 security of discovery, and for trying to get information out to the public as being also along with justice. So because, of course, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was no way he had the means or opportunity to actually pull off what we materially saw on September 11th. But the trying of him would have brought out some interesting things into an area where some of the circles that appear to be covering up September 11th most intensely, such as the judge in the area. Not only the background of people like Michael Mukasey or Michael Chertoff, but Alvin Hellerstein, whose son actually was involved legally with ICTS, an Israeli intelligence-linked contractor that was very much tied into the planes aspect of September 11th, and he has been the sole funnel through which all of the potential civil liability aspects, and even potentially criminal, I imagine, aspects of September 11th must go through. And in the combination of that with someone like Feinberg, is that his name? The payment.
Kenneth Feinberg. He pops up at all the major events and handles the payments to the families and to the victims.
So when you have that combination of the paymaster and the sort of control point in the court system, you don't have any serious due process of discovery in relationship to September 11th. So my point in terms of pointing out that this Zainab Ahmad, who was doing years and years of actual prosecution, where she would go around the world and almost work in a diplomatic fashion with foreign governments and trying to get information about alleged Al-Qaeda terrorists, that type of thing, that this does begin to bring the expertise of someone who knows how to try things like counterterrorism in a Article 3 court in an open fashion. So I think that's pretty interesting. And then one last person who is not on this specific complaint is the Andrew Weissman, who was part of the Justice Department's fraud section. And interestingly, in the 90s, he worked on a case involving one Felix Sater. And everybody knows who Felix Sater is. And apparently Weissman was involved in turning Sater into some type of informant. So there could be some aspect of potential cover up there. And we definitely seen it in the subsequent years. But if there were something else going on in terms of counterintelligence here, this guy would know where some of the bodies were buried. So these are sort of interesting data points. And I don't know how all of this fits together, including Flynn's connections and Flynn's background. But I do think in the wake of this, where Flynn is either being labeled a traitor to Russia on one side, or a hero, a blighted hero or an icon of the new patriots on the other side, I think we need to actually deal with some of the data on the ground.
Oh yeah, definitely. And before we get into Flynn and Michael Ledeen and Ezra Cohen-Watnick and their connections to Flynn and what it might indicate about the foreign policy, particularly the Iran policy of the Trump administration, I did want to mention real quick in relation to Michael Mukasey, who you mentioned. Michael Mukasey has been one of these people who's been making the media rounds. He's been very defensive of the Trump administration, much like Alan Dershowitz has. And remember Giuliani, in talking about the immigrant travel ban, mentioned that Michael Mukasey helped draft this travel ban. And when Preet Bharara was removed as the district attorney for the U.S. prosecutor for Southern New York, there was talk of replacing him with Michael Mukasey's son. So while a lot of people make a big deal of these never Trumpers, and they'll point to someone like Michael Hayden, who's kind of a mouthpiece, figurehead, public public representative of Michael Chertoff's Chertoff group, as that it'd be an example of, oh, well, see, he's never Trump, we told you. But I mean, you got to look also at someone like a Michael Mukasey, who very much has flown under the radar in his apparent support for the Trump administration agenda. I just wanted to point that out. And anyway, with regards to Michael Flynn, there's two people who he has pretty significant connections to. I think roles should be analyzed as far as perhaps getting a real indicator of what the Trump administration's policy on Iran might be and why it might be receiving so much pushback. One of these people is relatively somewhat known. Another one is a more recent character who popped up, who became a much more prevalent figure, it appears, than he actually was given credit for within the media rounds. And the first person I want to talk about is Ezra Cohen-Watnick, who was I don't know if he was an assistant for Flynn at his national security advisor. He was close to him. He was one of the people who Flynn brought back with him. He has connections with Michael Flynn going back to his pre-days of the Defense Intelligence Agency, when Flynn was apparently very much involved with the opium trade in Afghanistan. And from there, he got a job in the DIA with Flynn, and he was brought in by Flynn and within the within his NSA gig. But
I just want to say first of all that I haven't seen any direct evidence that Flynn was directly involved in the opium trade. Just that we have the indirect evidence that the opium trade has gone way up in the post 9/11 era in Afghanistan, and being that Flynn during that era was involved on the ground in Afghanistan, he was doing intelligence. I think he was head of intelligence for JSOC and that type of thing at a time where it's very obvious that you would, similarly to Vietnam and the usage of military planes and even body bags to bring back drugs from the Golden Triangle, there is no indicators that the similar type of modus operandi is ever stopped and has been escalated in the post 9/11 era, and the movement of opium back in through Europe and then also into the U.S. homeland, where we have an intense opioid crisis. These are facts that lie on the ground that surround Flynn's background.
Well, thanks for pointing that out, and indeed, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is important it is very important to point that out. And so, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you for doing that. It's important in terms of maintaining as far as standards of integrity and reporting this stuff, and that we have. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But indeed, there is circumstantial evidence which just happens to coincide with Flynn's stint in Afghanistan and the rise of the opium and the drug trafficking. So anyway, I'm very glad you brought that up. And
he definitely didn't stop it.
No, indeed he didn't. That's very true. He did not stop it. That's for sure. So Cohen-Watnick goes from Flynn in Afghanistan to the DIA to the Nationals, to being a right-hand man of Flynn's within his post during his time as the National Security Advisor. So anyways, with Cohen-Watnick, you get this image of a very mysterious person. He has this background of being involved. I think you got to start with the whole, as a conservative on college campuses post 9/11, being involved with David Horowitz, Frank Gaffney type events, and from there he moves very rapidly, it seems, just from being a nobody on a college campus, just being a student, to moving up into the head ranks of the right next to the National Security Advisor. He's this very shadowy figure. There was an article written about him, a profile in the Atlantic, where both Michael Ledeen and Steve Bannon refused to even comment on Ezra Cohen-Watnick. And then from there, in addition to being an Iran hardliner, his wife has been connected to Russian PR efforts and propaganda efforts on behalf of the Russian government. And Cohen-Watnick, interestingly, was the person who gave this information to Congressman Devin Nunes back in late March, which was said to validate Trump's claim that he had been illegally spied upon in the campaign. So.
Yes, and Cohen-Watnick he's 30 years old, and he's the senior intelligence officer of the National Security Council. And very little is known of his background. And all of the intelligence veterans in the United States are like, this is way out of the ordinary. And it is pretty clear that Cohen-Watnick was trained at the farm, the CIA's training facility, but he was apparently trained as a DIA clandestine operations officer or operative of some sort. And he and Flynn likely probably did at least know of each other during their Afghanistan days, potentially. But the on the record statement is that Michael Ledeen's wife, Barbara Ledeen, actually hooked them up potentially. So that is very interesting. And then, like you said, that his now wife, Cohen-Watnick's now wife, I believe maybe Rebecca Miller, I'm not sure if that's correct, but she worked at a PR organization called Ketchum. I believe she didn't work there actually in the run up to this key moment where they helped Vladimir Putin get an op-ed in the New York Times in the wake of the Ghouta false flag, where he, although he said some very moderating and sort of deconflictualizing statements, he did not call out the obvious false flag that the Ghouta was, and that probably most of the intelligence organizations around the world knew it to be. So Ezra Cohen-Watnick is a figure. He looks like he very well could be a Mossad mole. I'll just say it like that. And what's interesting about that too is that in the wake of Flynn being ousted from the National Security Council, McMaster comes in, and a lot is made of his attempt to root out a lot of the Flynn characters. And the one that was supposedly the most difficult, the most deeply entrenched character that Flynn had brought in, or who knows who brought whom in, was Cohen-Watnick. Both Bannon and Kushner went to bat intensely for him. And even in this Atlantic article, it talks about that it refers to people that maybe he's just continues to be there because he's so good. But then in an alternative article in the St. Louis Jewish Light, it actually quotes people who were his classmates who basically said he was not a team player. He was not actually very good. He would snitch on people to the trainers, these types of things. So these are not the signs of a good team intelligence player. These are the signs of an intelligence mole to me. That's what it looks like. So people should go look at that. So this combination of these two characters that are very much intensely tied to Flynn, this alleged American patriot who's telling the hard truths that no one wants to hear, are Cohen-Watnick and Michael Ledeen. And in a parallel, similar fashion, I just want to lay it out in case we lose time to say it, is that Flynn a lot has been made of the money he was paid for the Russia Today junket trip, and he was sitting at the table of the RT conference. I think it was the 10-year anniversary conference with.
Yeah, it was the anniversary dinner.
He was sitting next to Putin with a lot of other Russian figures. Of course, Jill Stein was also at that table. But then
Blumenthal said to be there. I haven't proven it, but I've heard he was there.
So that's something to be investigated. And then a little bit more has been made of this $500,000 that Flynn was paid by a Turkish-owned organization, the Innovo BV, I believe it's called, which is basically a shell company set up in the Netherlands by a Turkish billionaire, Alptekin. And Alptekin has a background where he worked with or for Tom Lantos, who was one of the most intense Israeli partisans in the Congress a couple decades back through many years. And some of the allegations are that some of the work that Flynn was doing was in relationship to an Israeli energy company called Ratio that had to do with things like the Leviathan, I believe it's called the Leviathan field. I think it's a gas field out in the Mediterranean. But again, this seems there has been a lot of denial here, but there are a sense that this does tie back into things that people were pointing out, such as the Israeli energy interest, such as Genie Energy, which of course Trump's main deputy campaign manager, Michael Glassner, who comes straight out of AIPAC and came out of a working relationship with Genie Energy. So the material relations here are unavoidable. But it was not only this Turkish shell company that also had very much tied directly into aspects of the Turkish government, including you see that infamous picture of Trump with Felix Sater and Tawfiq Arif. But Tawfiq Arif's son, Arif, I think his name is, he is very much tied into some of these networks that were apparently being, that Flynn was engaged with in terms of his Flynn intelligence organization, or Flynn Intel. And by the way, Flynn incorporated that company out of the house, supposedly, of Stanley McChrystal, the general that was, basically
starts to make you wonder why there was such, appears, an orchestrated effort to remove McChrystal during the Obama administration. Things that make you just start wondering about this. Never know.
Yes, and also the then unfortunate demise of the journalist who exposed McChrystal, Michael Hastings, in the subsequent years, who said he was onto a new story. So I don't know what was going on there. But then a key piece here that people are not really focusing on, especially in how it relates very much to what Flynn was supposedly tasked to do by Kushner in terms of advocating on behalf directly of the head of a foreign government in Israel, not in Russia, but in Israel, against the stated intentions and national interests of the then sitting administration, is that Flynn was paid as an advisor for this infamous Israeli intelligence cyber warfare firm called NSO, that has been covered a lot in aspects of the press and progressive media like Democracy Now! And NSO is formed directly out of a parent Unit 8200 Israeli signals intelligence operatives. And it was used to go after activists in many different situations. And it's basically some type of sort of spyware, aggressive spyware that's sold out from this company to governments around the world. So there you go. This was actually being done during the campaign. So yes, okay, whatever the Russia thing is, but here you have open and admitted ties to Israeli intelligence firms that's based on spyware that's been used against activists around the world. So there's certain resonance also with the Black Cube story out of the Harvey Weinstein story, and also then thinking about things like Kroll, of course, and just looping back to the first story about this New York incident. Of course, Bratton, who's the police commissioner in New York, was I believe he was probably working with Kroll during September 11th, and then was then inserted into LAPD in the wake of that to begin to help build out the whole fusion intelligence so-called centers, DHS, which is in many ways looks to be some type of occupying force. DHS represents in many ways potentially a Phoenix program type operation that's probably run for at least for the interests of a foreign power in Tel Aviv.
Well, before we run out of time, let's discuss Michael Ledeen a little further, because I feel we really need to really go a little more in depth on Ledeen, because with Ledeen, you mentioned all of Flynn's foreign policy dealings and these dealings with various governments. You know, Ledeen was a major player going back to many of the Gladio campaigns carried out in Europe in the early 80s via the P2 Lodge, I believe it was. And so Ledeen has long been involved in this game. And I would say Ledeen, out of all of these Project for a New American Century era neocons, he has been the person who has been the most flying under the radar. I'd say even more so than someone like Frank Gaffney has been Michael Ledeen. What are a few things about Ledeen that you feel people really need to know that that makes him such a significant figure?
The first thing is how little he's been talked about by some of these new patriot movements. I brought him up when I called into Alex's show right around almost the exact same time that these allegations were taking place in terms of this behind-the-scenes Israeli connivance. But it is wild that this hasn't been brought up, especially for how much has been talked about how Trump and Flynn are against the neocons, and yet the arch neocon, the darkest of the dark in many ways, Michael Ledeen, he was apparently brought in and brought up under Richard Pearl, who is the Prince of Darkness, who is also apparently maybe the head of the Clean Break group that included Fife and the Wormsers, and Wormser was one of the chief counsels to Dick Cheney, and this intense, this is very directly tied to Netanyahu. So the fact that this has not been brought up, that Ledeen, who's the guy who talks about waging total war, that he is very much uses language like every once in a while the United States has to sort of pick up and throw some type of a little third-rate country to show against the wall to show the world that we're serious. This is the kind of guy that this alleged American patriot, Michael Flynn, wrote his book with, that was released during the middle of the 2016 campaign. I believe it's called The Field of Fight. And people should just go look at YouTubes of Flynn and Ledeen appearing together on shows like Mark Levin and being interviewed about this. And nowhere do you hear anything about the deep state rooting out false flag terrorism, these types of things. No, it's all about the threat of the cancer of Islam.
Now Ledeen is bringing in one of Ledeen's major co-conspirators with the Iran-Contra, Oliver North, going to help lead this effort to throw the deep state out of power, allegedly, with Pompeo and I forget the other person.
Isn't it interesting that it really does look like just a reformation or a reforming of this old school Iran-Contra characters in many ways, whether it's Oliver North or Michael Ledeen. And of course, Michael Ledeen was not only at the center of Iran-Contra, where he was played a key role in relationship to this Iranian agent who was also called a Mossad agent, Manuchar Golbanafar, who was the key figure in terms of some of these weapons transfers. And that was back in the 80s, of course. And apparently someone like Adnan Khashoggi, who's a key figure that people need to know about, who by the way, was the person who Trump bought his yacht from, apparently orchestrated by one Roger Stone, that Khashoggi was a major player who helped introduce Golbanafar to the Israelis, apparently, and then the Israelis introduced Golbanafar to Ledeen. So Ledeen is at the very least, some type of channel, Israeli intelligence channel of some sort. But Ledeen also, in this article, we're going to run out of time, but I want to direct people to read this article in the American Prospect by Laura Rosen back, I believe, 2005, where it talks about the role that Ledeen played in this December 2001 meeting in Rome, where the Office of Special Plans and people like Douglas Feith, and then also, I believe, convicted Israeli spies like Larry Franklin and Harold Rode, were meeting in relationship to the Defense Intelligence Agency. And in fact, they cut out the Central Intelligence Agency out of this meeting, interestingly, and it was done in the presence of Israeli military intelligence. So what was going on there, and the fact that this type of thing led to the kind of fraudulent intelligence that helped launch the war in Iraq that has killed millions of human lives, including thousands and thousands of Americans.
Remember also that Ledeen immediately wanted to go into Iran. He was, at the time of the Iraq war was launched, saying that really we don't need to be focused on Iraq. Iran is the main prize that we need to be focused on. So I mean, makes you wonder what all was stopped that the Bush administration, perhaps maybe Dick Cheney, planned on actually waging, that was actually stopped by people within, that you've identified before in the past, who may have played a role in stopping a potential false flag that could have been blamed on Iran. And we are, I guess, about out of time anyway. The third person I was going to mention was Eric Prince, who's working with Pompeo and North, allegedly, to create a new type of front to fight against the deep state, so to speak.
So anyway, this needs to be continued to be rooted out, and the only way to do that is to lay the facts on the table. So, well, thank you very much, Greg, and let's return to this in the future.
Oh, we will for sure. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.